In Chapter 9, we're going to be looking at a variety of different things, but primarily what we're going to be looking at is how voting, elections, and campaigns take place in the United States. There's going to be an emphasis in this first video on the voting process and the elections of members of Congress. Then we're going to watch a video that talks more about how the president gets elected. To really understand how our elections and campaigns take place in this country, we need to understand that democracies around the world elect their officials in different ways. And the way or the system that is used by a country to elect their officials is simply known as their electoral system. There are a variety of different electoral systems, and when we get into the chapter that deals with political parties, we'll compare the United States electoral system with that of other countries. But for this point in the class, you just need to understand that the electoral system that we use in the United States is known as the SMSP electoral system. And what the SMSP stands for are two things. The SM stands for single member, which means in the vast majority of elections in the United States, whether you're talking about elections for city council or elections for president or elections for Senate or elections for a state legislature, each of those elections generally only has one winner. It's also known as the winner-take-all system. And the second part of our electoral system is what we call the SP, or simple plurality, which means the winner of most of the elections in the United States is the candidate that wins a simple plurality of the votes. We've talked about this before, but just as kind of as a reminder, a majority is when you win more than 50% of the votes. If you win with a plurality, that means you have simply received more votes than anybody else. So our electoral system in this country is based on two basic premises. First, that there will be only one winner in each election, and that winner will be determined by the candidate who receives a plurality of the votes. Now, just a little bit of information here. When we talk about us having a single-member, simple plurality electoral system in this country, that means a vast majority, most of our elections are based on that concept. Since the U.S. Constitution has left voting and election decisions, for the most part, up to the states, there are a handful of states in the United States, Louisiana being the most prominent one, that uses a single-member, simple majority system. So there are a few states that require the winning candidate to receive more than 50% of the vote. And again, we will talk about some more of this when we talk about political parties. So understand that our electoral system, the single-member, simple plurality system, greatly affects how we vote, who votes, who doesn't vote, and things like voter turnout. Another aspect of the American political system that we really need to understand here is how we as Americans vote. And when I say how, I don't mean physically, we go into a room and we pick a ballot and we mark a mark on it. That's not what I'm talking about. When I say how do we vote, I'm referring to how are we thinking? What's the thought process that we're going through when we vote? And the first two types of voting that we find here in the United States are straight ticket voting and split ticket voting. Right now, let's take a look at the difference between straight ticket voting and split ticket voting and some of the things that have happened in the country that have impacted whether Americans vote straight ticket or they vote split ticket. The first type of voting I want to talk about is what we call straight ticket voting. And straight ticket voting is when you take your ballot, and instead of going down your ballot and saying, I want to vote for a Republican for president and a Democrat for the U.S. Senate and a Libertarian for Congress and maybe a communist for school board. Instead of doing that, what you do is on your ballot, as you see here on the screen, you simply circle or make some mark next to the name of one particular party. And what happens is when you make that mark next to that particular party, every person on the ballot that belongs to that party will get your vote. When you're voting this way, you care more about the party of the candidate than you do about who the particular candidate is. When we vote straight ticket, people tend to be what we call very party-centered. They care more about the party of the candidate than really about individual characteristics of the candidate. There's a phrase that we use a lot called yellow dog Democrats. And they're a very real phenomena. A yellow dog Democrat is a person who votes straight Democratic ticket, regardless of who's running. And this phrase, yellow dog Democrat, came from a person who said that I am such a strong Democrat that I would even vote Democratic if there was a yellow dog running on the ticket. It is very, very party-centered. This method of voting, straight ticket voting, was more prominent, more common when political parties were stronger in this country. You know, late 1800s, early 1900s, this was a very prominent way of voting. We don't vote straight ticket quite as much as we used to now. As a matter of fact, a lot of states, including Missouri, have outlawed straight ticket voting. There's not that option any longer. So how most Americans vote today is by split ticket voting. And split ticket voting is when you vote for a Republican in one election and a Democrat in another, or maybe a Libertarian. As the sample ballot shows you on the screen, this person voted for John McCain and Sarah Palin for president and vice president, who are strong Republicans. But when they voted for their U.S. Senator, they voted for Al Franken, who is a Democrat. So they split their ticket. They split their voting. When you do the split ticket voting, you tend to be more candidate-centered because Republicans are different than Democrats in some ways. So what this person did when they were voting is they said, I like John McCain. I like his individual characteristics. I like what he can do because of John McCain, not because he's a Republican. But when it came to the U.S. Senator, there was a Republican running, but they chose Al Franken because, for some reason, they felt that Al Franken was a better candidate. So they split their ticket, and they were more candidate-centered. Talking more about, Democrats, there's a phrase out there now called blue dog Democrats. These are Democrats who are moderate. These people that call themselves blue dog Democrats don't vote straight Democratic ticket like the yellow dogs did. This person who voted may have been a blue dog Democrat because they were voting for the best candidate. They liked the Democrat, but they liked John McCain too, so they were more moderate voters. This is the way we tend to vote now because parties aren't as powerful as they used to be. And again, we'll talk more about why parties lost some of their power, and we'll talk a little bit more about this split ticket versus straight ticket voting later in the semester when we talk about political parties. Those are the first two things I want you to understand when we talk about how do we vote. The last thing that I want you to think about when I pose the question of how do we vote is something that we call issue voting. When we vote today, we are voting less on what party the individual belongs to, and we're voting more about what does this candidate bring. Why do I like this candidate? And the most common way that we decide which candidate we like better is how that individual candidate stands on the issues. And when I'm trying to decide if I want to vote for Barack Obama or Rick Santorum, how those two differ on the issues, what I can do is I can look at them from one of two perspectives when I'm deciding who to vote for. I can do what's called prospective voting. In other words, I'm looking forward. I'm saying, what will you do for me if you get elected? It's much harder to do prospective voting because we have to do research. We have to try and figure out how this candidate would act if he or she was elected. And since it's harder to do, it's the least common way. Most Americans don't use this prospective voting thought pattern when they're deciding who to vote for. Rather, what most individuals in the United States do when they're voting is they're still voting on the issues, but they're doing what's called retrospective voting. And retrospective is just basically looking back. And you basically ask them the question, what have you done for me? So in other words, if I'm voting retrospectively, the first question I'm going to ask is, what has Barack Obama done for me? If I think Barack Obama has done good things for me personally as president, I'm probably going to vote for him. But if I'm saying Barack Obama has not done good things for me, then I'm not necessarily going to vote for Rick Santorum because of what I'm hoping he will do. I'm voting for Rick Santorum because he's not Barack Obama. This is much easier to do. All we have to do is compare what Barack Obama has done in the past. And if we don't like what Barack Obama has done in the past, then we vote for Rick Santorum because we're hoping that Rick Santorum will act differently than Barack Obama. It's easier to do, and therefore it's probably the most common method used by Americans when they're doing what we call issue voting. So make sure you understand the difference between split ticket voting, straight ticket voting, and also understand what we talk about when we talk about Americans being issue voters. And if they're voting based on issues, understand there's two types of issue voting, prospective voting and retrospective voting. Now, if we focus in on the election process or how a person gets elected to political office in this country, we need to understand that the election process in this country for most offices is really a two-step process. If I want to be a member of Congress representing the 8th Congressional District, there are really two elections I have to win. First, I have to win the election within my party to be the member of my party that gets nominated, and then I have to win the general election in which the nominees of each party face each other, and then whoever wins that general election actually wins the office. So you need to understand the difference between the party nomination process in this country and the general election process. You have party nominations for many offices. If you're running for governor, you have to win your party's nomination and then win the general election. If you're running for state representative, you probably have to win your party's nomination and then the general election. If you're running for Congress, you have to go through that two-step process. And the very obvious election is the presidential election. There are two steps in the process of getting elected president. As we see right now, in 2012, the Republicans are fighting it out to see who's going to be the Republican nominee for president. After the Republicans have chosen their nominee, then the Republican nominee will face off against Barack Obama, who has already gotten the Democratic nomination for president, in the general election. We generally call the party nomination process the primary, and then we have the general election. The big difference is if you win your party's nomination, all you do is you win the right to be on the general election ballot against people from the other party. You have to win the general election in order to be the person who actually wins office, gets to hold office. What we need to realize here is that there are some pretty significant differences between the nomination process for Congress and the nomination process for the president. As we've talked about in previous discussions in this class, members of Congress, primarily the House of Representatives, are elected through what we call a direct election process. The people that go to vote for a member of Congress is voting directly for the one person that they want to represent them in the House of Representatives. It's a direct process. When we look at the congressional nomination process, that is the same thing. When I am voting in a primary or the nomination process to decide who I want to represent my party in the general election, I go in and I vote for Joanne Emerson or Emily Firebaugh or Bob Camp. I vote directly for that person, and that person gets my vote. At the end of the night when that primary or nomination contest is held, they count how many votes each person got for the Republican Party, and whichever person has won a plurality of the votes from the Republicans will become the Republican nominee. And they do the same process in the Democratic primary. So it's a direct process. It's a very simple process. When we look at the presidential nomination process, this is much more complicated. There are actually a Republican nomination contest and a Democratic nomination contest in each of the 50 states. And then after each of the 50 states have completed their nomination process, then people from each of those states go to the Republican National Convention or the Democratic National Convention, and those people vote for who they want their party's nominee to be. It's more of an indirect election. It's much more complicated. And we're going to spend more time. You're going to watch a video in this chapter that talks strictly about the presidential nomination process. But the congressional nomination process is relatively straightforward. After each party has had their nomination process, then we have the general election, and then whoever wins the general election actually wins whatever office they're trying to get elected to.